For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ed Davis. I'm the Anglican and Coordinating Chaplain here at the University. I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all here this evening. A number of you will be familiar with this annual event organised by the Chaplaincy on behalf of the Spencer family. It seeks both to remember Anne Spencer, a much-loved daughter, sister and academic colleague, and to facilitate engagement between Christian theology and contemporary issues, and to do so within the context of higher education. This is now the 23rd Anne Spencer Memorial Lecture. Themes in previous years have included the environment, economic justice, psychotherapy, poetry, interfaith relations, and last year, peace in Israel and Palestine. This year, I'm delighted that Ruth Hunt has accepted the invitation to come and speak on the role of faith in social change movements. I'll briefly introduce Ruth in just a moment, but first I just wanted to say a few words of introduction about this year's theme. So why this theme? Firstly, because it's one that matters within the university. Equality, diversity and inclusion are key values and priorities for the university, for its students and for its staff. And this has been identified as a cornerstone of our new vision and strategy as a university. Equality, diversity and inclusion with regard to sexuality is a significant strand of that, and is recognised, for example, through the university's role as a Stonewall Diversity Champion and being designated Best Employer at the Bristol Pride Awards last year. So that's one reason why it's great to be able to host the Chief Executive of Stonewall here within the university. And I know many students and staff here will be glad to have the opportunity to hear Ruth speak. Others here aren't necessarily members of the university, but are perhaps members of local faith communities. And that is another constituency for whom this theme matters, for whom it is often a live issue. It matters to those who are LGBT and have experienced exclusion, judgment, or discrimination in their encounters with faith groups. It matters to those who wonder whether their religious and sexual identities are compatible or will be deemed so by others. And it matters to those members of faith groups who are concerned about what is being perpetuated in their name. Yes, there are those who prioritise continuity, who find their received traditions of theology and practice challenged by greater LGBT inclusion. But there are also many who long for change, and whose faith is the very thing that motivates and resources their desire for inclusivity, their desire to recognise, to welcome, to support diverse sexual identities and expressions of love. The question then becomes how to be most effective in this work of inclusion, which brings us to our title. What then can be the role of faith in social change movements? And so to briefly introduce our speaker. As many of you know, Ruth is the Chief Executive of Stonewall, which is the largest LGBT equality body in Europe and works more widely across the world. Since taking on the leadership in 2014, Ruth has led the development of Stonewall's groundbreaking policy, campaigns and research outputs, including its work to tackle homophobic bullying in schools, to improve the health of lesbian, gay and bisexual people, and to campaign for trans equality. Ruth has committed to bringing Stonewall even deeper into communities, engaging with groups from different ethnicities, religions and geographies. She is a practicing Roman Catholic and has spoken out in favour of bridging the gap between faith leaders and LGBT communities. In 2015, Ruth was voted the third most influential LGBT person in Britain in the Independent's Rainbow List. I don't know, maybe you've gone up since then. And in that year, she also received 2 honorary degrees from Cardiff University and from Keele University. So we're very honoured to have Ruth here in Bristol this evening. Thank you very much for coming, and let's welcome Ruth as she comes forward to speak.
Good evening, and thank you for coming out this evening. I'm sure there is a whole host of different things you could be doing. I'm sure there's some good television on. There's a general election that seems to be pulling everybody's focus. But tonight we're going to talk a little bit about faith, sexuality and gender. The title of this talk is about the role of faith in social movements, and to a certain extent we will widen out to that, but I will be talking about my faith and the work I've done in the social movement that I've been most concerned about. But I think that one of the reasons why I chose that title is because I think faith communities run some of the most effective social movements in the world. Jesus Christ was an optimum campaigner. He worked in slogans, he worked in gesture politics, he knew how to capture the imagination, and he knew how to make it easy for people to follow him and support him through very simple and plain messaging. And the Bible, as a campaign manual of how to live and how to inspire others to live, is pretty successful 20 centuries on. It has to be handed to him. He did have a flair for the inspiring movements and people to follow him. For those of you who will notice, I don't read from notes, partly because I'm very dyslexic, and I long ago learnt that trying to read from a piece of paper was less successful than just talking. It is a nightmare for my comms function. They are constantly anxious about what I might say. And my only message would be, forgive me if I say anything that is out of turn, but if you are a fan of social media, feel free to tweet anything, but don't tweet about my parents. They get a bit upset if they hear about themselves and my personal life via the medium of 140 characters, which seems reasonable. I've learnt since I've been chief exec over the last 2.5 years to make some certain provisions to respect the privacy of my family on some of these stories. I can tell my story about being Catholic, it's quite another to tell theirs. However, I will talk about it, just don't tweet about it. So Stonewall, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Stonewall and our ways of working, and a little bit about my background in that and the background of the LGBT equalities movement, because all those histories are what makes some of the discussions that are happening now between faith, sexual orientation and gender identity so pertinent. So Stonewall was set up in 1989 in response to something called Section 28. And Section 28 was a piece of legislation that prevented the promotion of homosexuality in schools. It came after 2 generations of lesbian and gay people, and it was generally talked about in terms of lesbian and gay. 2 generations of lesbian and gay people who'd been told that they were unequal in all sorts of regards. Tomorrow I'm speaking at the University of Reading, where Wolfenden, who was the Dean and Vice-Chancellor of Reading University, oversaw a report that led to the decriminalisation of same-sex activity between men in 1967. He wrote his report in 1957. It took a decade to basically tell gay men that they were no longer illegal. So we had a whole generation of gay men and men who had sex with men being told that who they were was fundamentally unlawful, that it was akin to any kind of deviation, legal deviation. Women didn't get talked about at all, very much, which has a similar but different impact on people's sense of self and self-esteem. There is one thing to be told you are completely vilified, it is another thing to be told you don't exist, or that you are so severely mentally ill, you're a risk to your children and your family. The next generation who came through, of course, the children of that generation were told that they were single-handedly responsible for HIV. So we had a whole generation in the 80s who were told that they were the cause of HIV and that AIDS was the cure. And again, what we saw was lots of women being involved in that care, but the NHS, social care providers, generally the state, were very slow in responding to the epidemic that was affecting the men who have sex with men community. So a generation of men who were completely illegal, a generation of men who were scared and were thought to die, and many men who did die and then we had Section 28. That's a very swift summary of what can only be described as quite a traumatic experience for a generation of people who identify as LGB. For trans people, it was slightly different. There was the right to be trans if you had the means to transition. If you had the money and the resources, you could change your gender and get the right paperwork. A woman attempted to secure a better payout on her divorce, and the judge ruled that her marriage was completely invalid because she wasn't a woman at all. And what that revealed was that there was no legal standing whatsoever for people who transitioned within the eyes of the law. So in 1989, a group of people got together, and under the direction of, I think the rumour has it that it was a conservative-orientated civil servant, they were encouraged to set up Stonewall. And that was Ian McKellen, you'll know him as Gandalf, or Magento, depending on what generation you are, X-Men over there, rather than Richard III. So Ian McKellen, he came together with Michael Cashman, Lisa Power, a whole generation of people, and decided to set up a highly strategic lobbying group. It was going to be non-democratic, utterly pragmatic, and entirely focused on outcomes. It wasn't going to attempt to generate a membership. And it was criticised. It was criticised at the time by LGBT people who felt that that was elitist, who felt that that was excluding, that it wasn't a particularly collaborative, partnership-orientated way of working, but their ethos was to get the job done. And over 15 years, worked very hard on achieving legal change for LGBT people. And something happened. John Major said, "I completely commit to achieving every legal equalities for LGBT people." Then he lost his government. Shame. Tony Blair came in 97 and made a similar commitment. And of course, it's worth remembering that EU law also had a bearing. But it was only until 2003 that LGBT people could not be fired from their job for being LGB. It took a long time for these laws to come through. It really was from 2003, 2004 the Civil Partnership Act came in, 2014 marriage. It was a very quick decade of quite dramatic change for a generation who'd just been told that they were other and that they didn't deserve the same rights and responsibilities as everyone else. And people now look at that decade and say, well, it's marvellous now, without realising quite how long it takes for society to change, quite how long it takes for individuals to discard the hurt and the shame and the anxiety that comes from those decades of oppression because you can now get married. The right to pay taxes like heterosexual people does not negate the homophobic bullying you experienced at school, the fear you experienced when you thought your parents might reject you, the anxiety you felt when you might lose everything. The fact that government now says, yes, you can get married, is not an antidote. It certainly goes a long way to change, but it is a very swift change. 2004, therefore, was a big year. We had Civil Partnership Act, and Civil Partnership Act now, people are a bit shruggy about it. They're like, well, it was a bit of a halfway house. It was truly revolutionary at the time. Marriage, introducing of marriage to same-sex couples was decades away, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But civil partnership was a big deal because it was acknowledging that same-sex relationships existed. At the same time, the Gender Recognition Act came in that gave formal legal recognition to trans people. So two big pieces of legislation. So when I started at Stonewall in 2005, I was a 25-year-old baby dyke. I'd come in to an organisation that at that stage was 25 staff and a turnover then of 1.7 million. We are now 120 staff and a turnover of 7 million. And I share that with you because it gives an indication of just how much Stonewall's changed in 11 years. Stonewall receives no core government money. We have it as a principle. I doubt in the old days it was offered, so it was quite an easy principle to adhere to. Now, as CEO, I'm slightly reluctant that that's a core part of our mission because we could do with a little bit here and there, particularly from the Foreign Commonwealth Office to do some of our international work. But no, it's a principle we stand by, and I'm proud to stand by it. But in those days when I started, my job was to change hearts and minds. So the team were dedicated to changing the law. My job was to change hearts and minds. And that meant conducting research into the needs of LGBT people at that stage. Trans only came in 2014. Looking at how LGBT people experience discrimination, where they live, work, socialise, play and pray. And in those days, I would suggest that Stonewall was still pursuing what I would describe as a relentlessly assimilationist agenda. It was all about making sure that everybody understood that gay people, and we tended to use the word gay a lot rather than lesbian, gay and bisexual, gay people were normal. Normal, normal, normal. There was nothing to see, nothing to worry about, nothing to be concerned about. They were having the best of times. They were just like heterosexual people. They wanted to get married and have their children, and they wanted to pay their taxes. And we really perpetuated the notion of what I call a good gay. And a good gay is someone who is not too camp, not too challenging, probably not too political. I got mentored a lot to wear beautiful blouses and softer tops and softer hair. And there was a real tendency to demonstrate that gay people were just like straight people. We just happened to fancy someone of the same sex rather than the opposite sex. And it was about the simplest presentation ever of what it was to be LGBT. And how we dealt with the church in those times was that was for them. Faith was somewhere over there. And my predecessor, who was on the record of being absolutely agnostic in his attitude to faith, was very quick, and rightly so, called out the kind of homophobia that was often spoken from faith leaders. Because there was a time when it was perfectly acceptable to use some of the most abhorrent language going in the name of faith when talking about sexual orientation. That still remains, and I'm not suggesting that that's something in the past, but Stonewall certainly was very sneering in our contempt of this institution. I always remember my predecessor talking about how there were more employees working for Stonewall employers through our Diversity Champions programme than were members of the Church of England. It was certainly a way of having a little bit of a dig at the different powers that were going on. So where was I in all this? Well, I was doing my job. I had held 8 different posts in Stonewall over that period of a decade and climbed the ladder and did lots and lots of different work. But I was never, ever out as a Catholic. So my sexual orientation and my lesbian identity was something that I was very articulate about. I could take different stages in different contexts and talk about it at length. I never talked much about faith. So where does my faith come from? Well, I was brought up in a Catholic family. We went to Catholic school. It was part of our upbringing. I was born in Wales, and the Welsh Catholic community is relatively small. You know, there's one primary school in Cardiff, and you all go and you know everybody. And my cousins and my family, my extended family, were all part of this church community. Now, my parents have very much moved on from God. I think they believe in, I don't know what they believe in this week, but it's a journey for them. And I know that as they get nearer to older age, I'm sure God will come back. Don't tweet that, they'll kill me. But they've been on a different journey, but I think that me and my brother were very much brought up in that Catholic faith. And I, who was a vociferous reader and read everything, certainly read the Bible, certainly loved C.S. Lewis, read everything I could get my hands on. And when I was 12, my aunt died. And my aunt, who was 32, died in childbirth and left 3 very little kids, a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old and a baby. And when you're 12, something like that has quite a profound impact on your sense of self, your sense of belonging, your sense of priorities, and your own sense of identity. And what happened at that moment was that the Catholic Church absolutely wrapped itself around our family, in the way that church communities do very well, I think, in moments of crisis. So is my belief in God a psychological crutch in response to the trauma that I experienced at the age of 12? Well, I'm sure that some would say so, but it meant that at the time when most of my peers were being very cynical and adolescent about faith, I was actually more driven towards learning more. And at a time when I could have gone in a different direction, I found myself reading more and praying more and finding more solace in my faith. Why Catholic? Because to a certain extent, I think at that age, if you've been brought up in a Catholic faith, it is not the time to kind of say, well, I think the Methodists have got something for them. And the parishes and the little chapels in Wales are all pretty hardcore, and I like my high ceilings. So it was probably very much driven by aesthetic at the age of 12. It kind of wasn't a very thoughtful or considered position. When I was 14, I realised that I fancied girls, and I went to Cardiff Library and read all the books, of which there weren't many. I read The Well of Loneliness and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. Now, for any of you in the audience who are not familiar with lesbian culture, can I strongly advise that if ever a young woman comes to you thinking that they might be a lesbian, do not give them The Well of Loneliness and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. They are the two single most depressing books in the history of the world. And for someone who was holding faith and an emerging sexuality, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, which is an incredibly profound and interesting book, was pretty hardcore for a 13-year-old to be reading. And of course, I didn't particularly understand the difference between evangelical and Catholic. I didn't really get that. So it was worth some degree of trepidation that I approached my priest and said, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I really fancy girls." And he said, "Get on with your GCSEs, kid." And it was probably the single most important thing that I needed to hear in 1994, with Beth Jordache in Brookside kissing a girl and liking it and then killing her father, and The Well of Loneliness on my bookshelf next to Julian of Norwich and C.S. Lewis. It was probably the most important thing. Now, if I was speaking to an LGBT youth group at this stage, they would probably say to me, "You were oppressed," and what they should have said was that they should have been more affirming. And I'm sure that in a perfect world, my priest at that moment would have been more affirming of my stumbling, emerging identity. But actually what I needed to do was get my head down and do my GCSEs. And he gave me permission to be at peace with the conflict that was going on within me. And he made it very clear that I would always be and remain part of his parish and his family. And I remember the feeling to this day. And it was deeply profound and deeply important. So then I went on a normal adolescent journey, and we moved to Birmingham as a family when I was 16. I was writing for a magazine called Diva, which is a lesbian magazine, and they were paying me £400 a month for an article. And so I'd get a cheque that I used to pay into my Instant Bankers book chequebook account. And my parents didn't know. So suddenly, my £10 a week pocket money, they must have thought I was drug dealing or something. I had this massive cash injection and was coming out in Birmingham. Now, the thing about coming out in Wales, when you've only got a library and the Well of Loneliness, Birmingham has a whole street of gay pubs. So I was suddenly in a whole different world, but was still getting my head down and doing my work. But I lived a long way away from my school, so I spent a lot of time commuting and would go to the big Catholic church in the middle of Birmingham. By then, my parents weren't going to church at all. We lived in Walsall, Bloxwich, that wasn't a local Catholic church. But I began to be much more anonymous in my faith. I didn't belong to a faith community. I never put my name down to read, and I still haven't. And it really distresses me because I really hate it when the reading's done badly. And my partner tells me that's pride and it's not very Christian and I should get over it, but it really annoys me. So I learned at the age of 16, 17 to tolerate really bad readings and being anonymous in church communities. And that was a different feeling. And when I went to Oxford at 18, so in 1998, went to Oxford, my parents hadn't coped well with my coming out. They thought I was too young and I was inexperienced. And they were from I was very much the first in my family to kind of go to Oxford, certainly. My mum had done further education at an older age. They desperately didn't want me to screw it up. And they thought that going in to a place like Oxford as someone who was openly gay would ruin my career, ruin my academic prowess. I would be judged. So they were so frightened. So I was ostracised from my family to a certain extent for that decade, and ostracised from my own sense of faith that was becoming increasingly private. So in Oxford, I was absolutely openly gay, and I was president of the JCR, Junior Common Room of the college, and I went on to be president of the student union. I took part in a documentary with Channel 4 called College Girls, so we had a film crew with us for 4 years, observing how 18 to 21-year-old women experience life. After much intervention from my parents, I decided to come out on film, so there was a film 5 of 6 films was all about human sexuality and my journey coming out. They cut that film, but the Telegraph still reported it, all that drama, all that door slamming. But at never at any of that point did I talk about my faith. Because I think that in 1998, to 2002, it was easier to be gay and come out and talk about being gay than it was to talk about being Catholic. And in a student environment like Oxford, where your allegiances and your tribes are very important, your college is important, what clubs you belong to is very important. I wasn't party political. The stylised scruff of the left was very confusing. The affluence of the right was not for me either. I was an independent candidate, very naive in lots of ways. I didn't want the God tribe. And I knew that CathSoc in Oxford University would cause me trouble in relation to my faith. So I went to a local church about 2 miles out of Oxford on my bike, sat at the back, resented how badly the readings were done, but didn't really get involved in parish life. So when I came to London and came to Stonewall eventually, I didn't talk about my faith at all. I would go to church, but what I was increasingly feeling, certainly from the age of 23 to 26, is that the church would reject me. And it felt that, and I was still reading my Bible, I read my Bible again, certainly as an undergraduate. You can't do English at Oxford without reading the Bible, and then read it again at 24, 25, and I tend to read it every 3 years. I don't read all the King's bit anymore, I skip that, but I'm still very interested. And when I read the Bible, what I'm struck by is the moment where Moses was drafted in because his cousin wasn't very good at public speaking. There's this whole bit in the Old Testament where there's this long diatribe. God says, "You will go and you will tell Pharaoh that he's a bad man." And his cousin says, "Yeah, I'm not really good at speaking, God. I'm really sorry. It's not really my bag." And God's like, "Ooh, okay, I'll get Moses." So it's this really kind of intimate moment in the middle of all this kind of very, very large pronouncements. It's this really cute moment of him going, "Yeah, I'm not really good at that. Can we get someone else?" And that always stayed with me. So in my 20s, it was those moments in the Bible that really stayed with me. And Ruth and Naomi, of course, which I never read as a lesbian story, and I don't now, but I do see it as a story of fundamental loyalty and truth, even when it's difficult to be loyal and true. And Thomas, who says, "I'm not sure I believe you," always had a profound impact on me. And there's a moment during the crucifixion story where Jesus says to John, "You are going to be crucified as well." And Peter says, "Yeah, but what about me?" And Jesus says, "What's that to you?" And there's these moments where it is absolutely clear that the noise of other people's interest in other people's business is kind of irrelevant. And I felt, as I was a teenager and in my 20s, my relationship with God could exist purely through those mechanisms, through the Bible, through my relationship with God, and the noise of organised religion was actually preventing my spirituality rather than enhancing it. And I think that then what happened is that I really got to a stage where I felt that I got very preoccupied with St. Paul. So I got very, very preoccupied with St. Paul because Wife of Bath was in my mind, and Wife of Bath did all right marrying lots of people. And St. Paul's very clear. St. Paul's very clear, go for celibacy, and if you can't go for celibacy, get married, I guess. And the St. Paul issue is the big dividing issue for LGBT communities. It is the issue. We talk about marriage as if it's about marriage. It's not. It's about celibacy and it's about marriage. And I thought, as I cannot be celibate in line with my sexual orientation, and I cannot get married, I might as well live the life of Riley. And from about the age of 26 to the age of 32, maybe not as long as that, I behaved badly. I enjoyed London and its rich offerings to the full. I drank too much. I had a life where I disrespected my partners. I was neither kind nor good. I did not act in a Christian way. I did not put my faith at the heart of my relationships or my ethos or my values, because if I could not do what the church required, why bother at all? And where I got to in my late 30s, no, I'm 37 now, so where I got to about 32 was realising, actually, I can live the values of Christ through my relationships and my values and my ways and my ethos. And actually St. Paul probably would prefer me to get married. He would prefer me to be monogamous and celibate, or monogamous with one person if I was unable to be celibate. So I had to go on this long journey of realising, well, Catholics Catholics are all sinners. We're all sinning all the time. And I wish that Tim Farron hadn't felt the need to clarify his position on sin, because actually sin is quite a complex concept for all of us. I wish I hadn't gone through that journey of rejecting so fiercely, because what I did in that time was harm myself. And in LGBT communities where you expect and hope and fear that you think you might be rejected, when you tell people who you are and you fail to suppress that, the fear that you will be rejected by those who love you, your friends, your family, your God, your communities, is so overwhelming, it is inevitable that that leaves a mark, and to a certain extent you reject yourself in that. Reconnecting yourself with those communities when they don't reject you takes time and requires some healing. I'm telling you a long story, I'm sorry, I hope you're okay. So when I was working at Stonewall, we were on the media phone, and the media phone goes to different members of staff, and I had the media phone one weekend, and I'd been out, and I woke up sleepily in the morning with the phone ringing, and I was a bit hungover, and the person on the phone said, they're cancelling the LGBT Catholic masses in Soho. Does Stonewall have a view on that? And I said, yes, it's terrible. There should be Catholic masses for LGBT people. It's really important. There is a space where LGBT Catholics can go. Are there any Catholic LGBT people? Yes, I said, I'm Catholic, I'm LGBT. Hung up the phone. Now, when you're Deputy Director of Public Affairs, nobody cares that you're Catholic, and nobody cares that a spokesperson from Stonewall said Catholic LGBT masses are very important. In 2014, when I was appointed Chief Executive, they really did care. So the headline of The Independent was, Practising Catholic takes over as CEO of Stonewall. And it was felt to be such a major moment, I even made it into the top 50 influential Catholics in the tablet. And my parents were going, are you still Catholic? We didn't know you were still Catholic. I was like, well, yeah, I go, and I like it, and I believe in one Holy Catholic Church, and I believe in the Pope, and I believe in transubstantiation. And I was like, really? I was like, yeah, we just haven't really talked about it. So suddenly felt wholly inadequate, because here it was, 2014, Chief Exec of Stonewall, already a big gig. Do you know what I mean? There's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of ways you can screw up, there's a lot of people who want you to do something differently pretty much every minute of every day. There are a number of people who have a very, very well articulated across any possible platform available view about what I should be doing differently at any given time. And I'm often told why I'm not gay enough, or why I'm not man enough, or why I'm not strategic enough. There's many reasons why I am faced to criticism. There is nothing like telling an LGBT community their new chief exec believes in God. And not only believes in God, but believes in the Catholic God, who, hard PR job at the best of times, let's be honest. The communities were really upset with me. And what really wounded me was the number of LGBT people who said, on every social media platform available, I was not fit to serve as chief exec of Stonewall, because believing in God was a mental illness, and it would detract from my ability to do my job, because I wouldn't be able to stand up to the bigotry of the churches in my attempts to change attitudes and challenge discrimination. Meanwhile, I'm a bit of an inadequate theologian. I don't know the Greek translation for sodomy in Leviticus section 2.6, and whether that was about angels or whether that was about I don't know any of that stuff. I don't know about the problematic texts. I've explored St. Paul in depth and think he was probably a little bit intense, and it's all right. And, but that's not going to stand me in much good stead. And I had a real crisis, and I thought, I don't know how to do this. I do not know how to be openly Catholic. I know how to be openly gay. I know how to chat to any audience on any subject, and I know how to be openly gay, but I don't know how to be openly Catholic. So I went to my priest and I said, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do this. I can't do a crash course on scripture. I don't have time to learn Greek. I can't do that now. And he said, well, what are you good at? And I said, I'm a good campaigner. I know how to run a campaign, and I know how to change attitudes, and I know how to do this, and I know how to do that. And he goes, right, well, it sounds like the LGBT Christian movement could do with a good campaigner right now, and could do with some help. And I said, I'm quite good at talking, and I've got good chat, and I can talk very honestly about what's going on. He said, well, then you need to talk, and you need to take platforms, and you need to talk about what it is to be someone who is attracted to women and has been attracted to women since early teens and who loves God. And you've got to own that. You've got to own that dual identity, and you've got to learn to talk about it. And people won't expect you to know the Greek translation of Leviticus and how it impacts on hospitality. And I thought, oh God, okay, all right. And I had a bit of a here I am, Lord moment, and a bit of a Samuel moment. And I thought, if this is my place, if this is my role as chief executive now, then that's what I'll do. And I've taken it upon myself to support the LGBT Christian movements to develop campaigns and articulate what the offers are without being shrill or hyperbolic. I've tried to take the egos out of those campaigns and make it less about me and more about us. I've done my utmost to support Stonewall as an organisation, to work with faith schools, to highlight role models, people of faith who are affirming of LGBT identities. I've done my best to talk to communities who are hostile and who believe that I am fundamentally doomed, and I have put myself in those positions, and I will continue to do so. And now in 2017 compared to 2014, I feel more at ease with that role. There are plenty of things I don't know, but when I think about the Lord's Prayer, and I think about forgive those who trespass against us as we forgive those who trespass against us, and I think that phrase is often felt and thought to be asking God to forgive those who trespass against us. And what I am very, very clear about is that it is in my hands to forgive those who trespass against me. And I have had to find a way to forgive those who tell me via every medium possible that I'm an abomination and I'm going to hell. Because that's in my gift to forgive them. And I think forgiveness is a very active choice. It's not an emotion. It's something you choose to do. And I forgive those who use their faith to attack the LGBT communities. But I will do my utmost to support those who will not attack, to find their voice. And there are many, many, many heterosexual people of faith who do not support the vilification and rejection of a community based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. And the very core principles of a Christian faith are things that should run through our entire social movement for inclusion, bringing people together, keeping people involved. Because no young person should feel the shame and anxiety and utter fear that they may be rejected by those they love, including God. It is not right, it's not fair, it's not Christian. And if I can go some way to articulating that, I will do so. Practically speaking, what that means is that I speak and make sure that Stonewall's doing its utmost to try and build bridges, not walls. So we will not suggest that an entire community is homophobic based on the voices of a few. I think the Church of England has got itself in an entirely knotty, messy situation. I don't think that the discussions that are taking place are really about same-sex relationships at all. I think they're about ways of disagreeing. I think they're about power. I think they're about holding the evangelical communion together across a world that is changing. I think it's about understanding how to hold that power differently. What's missing often from that dialogue is love and a respect for the individual. So I think that LGBT people have become the football in what is a much bigger discussion in the Church of England. And I believe that when LGBT people realise who they are and they go through a process of owning their identity and acting with integrity, they are more open to recognising their faith and connecting with God in a way that is highly significant and highly profound, because it is so very much tested in the public domain. So LGBT people are in a really good place for the church. They are almost the saviours of the church, if you let them be. They are the biggest fans of marriage right now. And as someone who has worked in social movements for quite some time, we're quite good, the LGBT communities, at running social movements. And we could probably help the Church of England fill its pews, because we know how to communicate and we know how to message. And I think that one of the things that I'm most aware of is that there is an opportunity here to change the way in which we disagree and change the way in which we talk and disagree with each other on these matters that aren't about ostracising and evoking shame in individuals. And I think the LGBT community has a responsibility to help try and shape that narrative and improve it. I'm also aware of all the work I do with employers. Stonewall works with 750 employers, MI5, Barclays, EY, University of Bristol, the whole shebang. And we talk a lot about the impact it has on LGBT people who are not able to be open about their sexual orientation or gender identity in the workplace. I think something similar happens to people of faith. I think people of faith go to work and leave their faith outside the door. I would suggest that my leadership and my approach to leadership is utterly shaped and defined by my faith. Utterly. My belief in the principles of Christianity affect very much my decisions about how I work in partnership with people, how I empower people, how I approach problems and how I approach difficulties. I think people should be able to bring their faith into the workplace. That doesn't mean proselytising, it doesn't mean being evangelical, but faith shapes values, and we should be able to talk about that. So my final point is that I think the LGBT communities are in a position to help Christians come out. And I think that's something we can do, and we can help you articulate what it is about being of faith that helps shapes your values. As far as Stonewall is concerned, Stonewall will continue to build bridges. We will continue to build coalitions with people. And my hope and aspiration is that no young person at the back of a congregation who is thinking about their sexuality feels they can no longer be part of that congregation. Because that is a damnation on all of us, if that's what's happening. I can get overly excited about marriage if you want me to, but actually I don't think that's what this is about. I think it's about inclusion and bringing people together. I think that when the government probably will get rid of civil partnerships, the Church of England have built themselves a right little nightmare of what they're going to do about clergy who are going to get married, but frankly that's not my problem. Good luck with that. But if we believe in the principles of kindness and treating each other well, then let's make sure that there is nobody who feels unable to be part of their communities and their faith communities. Thank you very much.
Ruth's going to take a few questions. I'm just going to turn the other mic.
So apparently the way you do it here is that you come to the mic and ask your question, so nobody has to run in between with the microphone. And none of you will ask a question for the first 20 minutes, and then lots of you will. Are there any questions or comments or thoughts? And I think what I would ask is that if there are questions, let's keep it respectful, and let's keep the tone in the spirit that I've attempted to evoke this evening. Let's not be mean. And if you want to say who you are, that's fine, but if you don't have to.
And first of all, I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your story and being so honest about everything that you encountered. You talk about the LGBT different aspects, but I'm really interested in the plus or the X, the kind of introduction of these other sexualities and other kind of genders. Yep. And what advice you give to those of us who feel they can't belong in either of the LGBT or T.
Yep. So I have used LGBT a lot as shorthand tonight, but I think that what we're finding, Stonewall's tagline is acceptance without exception, in recognition of the fact that it is a very broad umbrella that is emerging. I know that sometimes when I'm talking to communities who are very new to this, attempting to talk about non-binary identities in that context is quite difficult. Talking about multiple sexualities and identities is quite difficult, and I think it comes down to the fact that people should be able to act as they want to, as long as they act well and with integrity, and it is for people to navigate that space and respond to the individual needs. I think that we can sometimes get trapped in language, and I think that that can be quite frightening for people who want to do good. And I think one of the things I try and advise audiences, young audiences that I speak to, is to have kind eyes. And Stonewall has a philosophy of kind eyes, which means that when someone gets something wrong or says something wrong, we call in and we don't call out and we don't shame. And as long as people's intentions are good, we work with them. So I think we have to be quite forgiving of people wherever they're at on their journey. And I think that that means that educating and informing and working with is incredibly important, but not expecting everybody to get page 10 on the first go. Thank you. Hello.
You're powerful, amazing, thank you. Just wondering, what do you feel the role of faith communities and faith leaders is in apologising or in making retribution for things like that?
It's a good question, and I think that think that I was really struck when the Archbishop of Canterbury recently apologised, but on the same day also condemned the ecumenical communities in America for marrying. I think you can't give and take with the same hand. I think that if there is an apology, it has to be utterly authentic and meaningful. And I'm not sure faith communities, as faith leaders, quite know what they're apologising for yet. I've had many conversations with individuals who've been on their own journey and have changed their mind and have apologised to me for things they might have said to me in the past. But I think the most important thing is they forgive themselves in that. I forgave a long time ago, and I think part of the LGBT healing has to be about us letting go a bit of that resentment. I think harms that are being done to us now, we need to be mindful of and understand their impact. Harms that have been done in the past, I think for our own sanity, we kind of have to let some of that go. And I think that that's very personal, and maybe that's where I've got to in my journey on this, because I can't simultaneously hold a capacity to influence and work with whilst feeling that pain. I can't do that, so I've had to let it go. I can't see the Pope apologising anytime soon for any of the things that the Catholic Church has done wrong. He's running quite an extraordinary PR machine, in that one week he'll say something good about LGBT and the next week he'll say something bad, hoping that the different media will report it in different ways and that we won't know and won't read the two things. So I don't want that, and I would rather see change at a local level with parishioners who are genuinely inclusive.
Hi, thank you very much for an amazing talk. And possibly you've already started to answer the question that I was going to ask you, talking about forgiveness and being able to let go of stuff. Just by my background, I'm a card-carrying ex-evangelical Christian who's done their alpha courses, led on alpha courses, been with the same partner for, I'm going to get shot in the neck, I think the number of years wrong, 26 years I think it is, now married, still strongly full of faith, and gone on that journey in one way or another with the church. Spent 18 years not telling anybody, living with a complete messed up identity, really.
Yeah.
So the piece about being both is really helpful. My question really is for those of us who are still actively part of a faith community, what single piece of advice would you give in terms of helping the community to move the agenda forward without either rolling over, being bored, exhausted, hurt, angry, or anything along that spectrum? What is, in your view, the greatest quality to help move the agenda forward?
I think that it depends on what you use your faith communities for and what they are for you, and how you benefit from them. I mean, I've recently moved and started going to a new church, and my partner, who is atheist, offered to come along with me on Good Friday. And I thought, no, don't come on Good Friday. It's come at Christmas, do you know what I mean? But anyway, so she's determined. She came, and we look similar. Look, we don't, you can tell we're a couple, is what I mean. We stand out in a crowd, and everybody was so nice to her. Oh, are you here? It's very nice to see you. Are you kissing the feet of Jesus? She's like, no, I've seen where you're the great unwashed of Bethnal Green, kissing the feet of the crucifix. No, thank you. But they were very warm to her. Now, she didn't pretend to be anything she wasn't, and I think just showing up and being visible sometimes is the most powerful thing you can do, and that requires courage. I think the other thing is about helping your faith communities realise how they can inadvertently be very excluding. So certainly when I'm travelling, and I leave London once a week and go different places, I will always pop in. I went to Ash Wednesday in Glasgow, which is quite an experience, and the church was so heterosexual. It was oozing heterosexual from every bit of paperwork, every mums and dads come along and bring your kids and make sure this, everything about it was heterosexual. Whereas I think I've got more used in London churches that there's less of that and there's more inclusion. I remember my priest saying, we have lots of people in our congregation, and there are people who want children, there are people who are adopting children, there are people who are single, we've got same-sex couples, we've got lesbian and gay people, and that was very powerful. So I think it's about helping our faith leaders in our local parishes find a way to talk about the differences that exist within their congregations. But you have to be protective of yourself in that. And I am sometimes more selfish in my genuine interaction with my faith community than I am outside it. Because that hour a week for me, oh still small breath of calm, forgive me, Father, although I'm not worthy to receive you. These are very profound moments for me that are deeply spiritual and peaceful. I need to not be the gay one then, going, have you thought about queering this up a bit? Because I need a moment that's just me and my relationship with God, that I use that faith community to do so. So self-preservation is really important. Finding a community that feeds your spirituality rather than takes away from it. God wouldn't want you to be losing your faith through your faith interactions, but then helping your faith leaders just remember that there are different people in the room. I am, of all my friends, I'm probably one of the very few Catholics, and we know that parents send their kids to Catholic schools despite barely remembering which way round this is. So I am godparent to a huge number of kids. They know, double income, no kids, books every week, they get it, violin lessons, whatever. And of course these godchildren talk about Ruthie and Caroline. Their Auntie Ruthie and Caroline. They're in their Catholic schools. Of course they're going to talk about Auntie Ruthie and Auntie Caroline, because I'm the only one who gives them their kids' Bibles. Do you know what I mean? So this kind of notion that people in these faith communities don't exist with LGBT communities, even if they're not immediately in front of you, has to change as well. So the more you can do about helping change the peripheral vision, but self-preservation first and foremost. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for speaking. It was a very, very inspiring talk. I myself, I remember this, and I have to hold my hand up and say that I'm slightly ashamed that I came into this talk prejudging, thinking that there's the chief executive still, how can you do it? But you have explained that very, very well. So I'd like to thank you for doing that and actually setting my mind at rest that thinking that you can't be one or the other, because actually you can be both. And for me, my faith is very important. And I think that what you said about coming out in the workplace, that I think is the next barrier, I think, for us LGBT people, including myself. Being LGBT is one thing, but then actually coming out as something else extends it again, and you suddenly become the workplace weirdo, as it were. So I'd like you to explain a bit more about what Stonewall can do to actually overcome those hurdles.
Yeah, and it is about you can be one weird thing, but you can't be two. And I think the reason why there are far more openly gay men compared to women is a bit of that. What women say is that it's hard enough being a woman in this space, let alone kind of going, and I'm the gay one. And I think there is something about how we bring our whole selves to work that is quite complicated. Stonewall is working increasingly about drilling down into these communities. So we give voices to people from different ethnicities, but also different faith communities. And we've got a great array of posters that have gone into every school that feature LGBT people of faith and really getting into those communities. And we've trained people from faith communities to deliver training to teachers, for example, so that it is the Muslim LGBT person who is training Muslim teachers on homophobic, biphobic, transphobic bullying, rather than me. We get that there's different voices. I think that what Stonewall's learned over the last decade is that we've got a lot of really interesting ideas about authenticity. So we know a lot about the damage it does when you hide part of yourself in the workplace. And we've always done that through the prism of sexual orientation. And to a certain extent, gender identity. I think gender identity is different because lots of people don't want to come back and talk about their trans status. They want to present as they are, and that's important. But there is something about keeping a secret. And there's one thing about privacy, and secrets are very different things. Privacy is one thing, secrets are toxic. And through all our years, we run leadership programs, we bring 36 LGBT people together, we run role model all this kind of stuff. What I've learned, and what we've learned increasingly, is that some of those principles apply very much to communities of heterosexual women, and indeed heterosexual communities generally. So I do talks to mainly straight white men about inclusion in a workplace context. And always during that session, someone puts their hand up and says, I just want to apologise. I was getting divorced last year. I was a nightmare to work with. I was a complete pain. But I didn't tell anyone I worked with about that. And they didn't understand what was happening. And a woman stood up and said, my name is Sahima Rawat, but I married a guy called Mark last year. I didn't want to change my surname because I didn't want anyone to know I'd married someone who wasn't from my community. So these secrets, people have secrets that bubble up and get in the way. And I think what workplaces are working out is that actually the more you can bring yourself to work, the better. I think they get freaked about faith. So every organisation I go to, and I work with a whole, I'm doing a lot with football at the moment, so talk with the Football Premier League, and they're like, what happens if someone's got a faith? It's like, well, it's all right. The question is, what happens if someone says, I don't like gay people? Now, if they say, I don't like gay people because of God, your response to that is no different to someone who says, I hate gay people. It's quite straightforward. This is a working environment. You sign a contract. What you think at home is your own business. We're not the thought police. So there's something about enabling people to chill out a little bit about the God question, but also help people of faith talk about that faith in relation to the way in which they work and their values. And I think the more in which we can connect these things, so your Buddhist faith will have an impact on how you behave day to day, how you relate to people, how you resolve conflict, how you find peace, how all these things will be shaping your philosophy. We've got to find a way of expressing and articulating that. And I think that what Stonewall can do is start extending some of that learning on LGBT, which we've started doing with women's communities and with black, Asian, minority ethnic communities and disabled communities, particularly around hidden disabilities, because actually having a mental health problem and declaring that is as complicated as a sexual orientation sometimes. We can certainly start extending that to faith communities too, and we certainly try and role model that through our activities. So our staff are much more open about their faith than they have been. But it does mean that Stonewall is the one who is bigger championing about being opening about faith. I mean, it's quite an odd position for us to be in, that we're the kind of champions for talking about values. But Theresa May's all over Easter eggs, so it's okay. So she thinks, that's her talking about faith, and it's not. And actually, it would be more authentic if she talked about how her faith shaped her values. And that's why I do find, I have the utmost respect for Tim Farron and his faith. And I think that it's wrong the way he was pushed on that question. I don't think it's helpful or right.
Thank you, Ruth, for a fantastic talk. My name is Steve. I've worked for the university for the last 10 years. I'm also a former trained Catholic priest, so I studied for a priesthood for 6 years in total. And it's more just a couple of comments, really, on especially picking up on a couple of themes about how you can't be weird in two areas.
Yep.
And I've been in a number of long-term relationships. And what I've often found from both ex-partners and from people within my own community, within the LGBT community, is a mixture of fascination and abhorrence and this kind of thinking that because you're a person of faith, you are therefore that equates to this, and this. And some people are extremely uncomfortable with, so I'm familiar with the term God botherer, and I think if you do speak about your faith, that can bother a lot of people, and it can challenge a lot of people, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think for us as Catholics as well, it's kind of very much a top-down hierarchical structure, and yet it's important to remember that the people of God are the people in the pews, and they often don't have the same problems, the same struggles that maybe members of the hierarchy do at times. And I also share your view on really bad readings, too sin in the back, that kind of stuff. So really just a couple of comments. I think it's fantastic that you've come out and you've spoken about your faith. For me, that extends to people of all faiths and none, people who believe in a final judgment. For me, St. John of the Cross put it well when he said, in the evening of our lives will be examined in love. Yeah. I don't think I'll stand before God as male, as white, as gay, as Irish, as Catholic. I don't think those labels will kind of dissipate, and it will just be a judgment of the soul and how I've loved or refused to love others. Thank you very much again. No questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm Catholic as well, and
I study theology, so I've read quite widely. There's a fantastic author, a Lutheran author called Nadia Montgomery. I don't know if you've heard of her.
No.
She's fantastic. And in one of her books, she talks about her frustration with her church. I think this extends to the Catholic Church as well, of this phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin.
Yeah.
I myself feel that that's still quite a prevalent attitude in the church. My question is, do you still feel that, and how should we respond to that as Catholics?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question. I think it's something that people fall back on when they don't know how to talk about things, and it's an easy way to express their discomfort. For me personally, who thinks about sin an awful lot, because you do when you're Catholic, I think, I don't believe the love I hold for my partner is sinful. I believe that the ways in which I've behaved about previous partners is sinful. And I think that feels a bit angel on pinhead, actually, but it was a really important realisation for me. Because I do believe in behaving in a way that is outside what Jesus would want us to do. I think that we are all on a journey to be better, to be as good as we can be, and we make mistakes in that and we fall. I accept all that as part of my creed. And I think when I thought that the fundamental sin was being attracted to someone of the same sex, then all sin is therefore something that I can't manage or control. I might as well have no aspirations to not sin at all. So I do think the kind of love the sinner, hate the sin is a trite cop-out, and I think that I don't hear it much in the circles I move in my personal faith circles. What I think I also, and I know the Catholics in the room will know that what goes on in confession is utterly sacred, but what I would say is that in times when I have talked about things I regret, it has never been the same-sex relationship that has been the focus of the reflection. It's never been the fact that the person is a woman that has been the problem. It's been the fact that I'm a twat. It's been the problem. So there's a kind of, and I really admire the fact that any priest in any interaction I've had has responded in that way. Now, does that mean I'm having a unique and different experience compared to others? I doubt many LGBT Catholics go to confession and talk about their sin in the same way. I know lots of LGBT Catholics in my family, in my circles, don't go to confession. Whereas I think that it's an important part of connecting with your journey and what you're trying to do. It's the mechanism. It's like therapy, it's cheaper. So I think we have to help those articulate what it is they're uncomfortable about. But I think the intentions of people making that statement are good, because what they're saying is, I believe in love, and I believe in the fundamental purpose of love, and I believe in you, and who am I to judge, I think is what they're actually saying. And I think that should be acknowledged as a good thing, because I think those who say, I reject you, are those we should be standing up to, because those are the ones who are doing harm. Those who say, love the sinner, hate the sin, we can then get into, well, what do you mean by sin and what do you mean by sinner? I think that's an easier base to start from than some of those who are just openly hostile. So it's trite, it's contrived, and it's lazy, and I expect better from our theologians, and the intellectual side of me is disappointed with the lack of imagination in that response, but at least we've got somewhere to work on from that. And it does come down to, what is sin? And what does the Bible say? And, there's plenty of gifts out there that say Jesus talks about heterosexual relationships thousands of times and never mentions same-sex relationships once, and this, that, and the other. And the prevailing theme in the New Testament is love, and treating each other well and being good to each other. And I think if we accept that same-sex relationships and same-sex desire is a thing, requiring LGBT people to be celibate when we don't expect heterosexual people to be able to manage that standard is blatantly unfair. So unless we're at a stage where we're expecting heterosexual people to go, well, celibacy is the goal and we should all be aspiring to that, in which case we are all sinners, except those who are not celibate, they need to kind of reassess where we sit in that narrative. And that's the fundamental difficult one to do. And that's the battle, and that's what will lead to the split in the church, I suspect. But I don't use contraception, so I'm a very good Catholic.
Thank you so much for an absolutely amazing talk. There's been a lot of, in your talk, talking about how slightly. I guess I'm coming at it from the perspective I'm a Quaker, and I'm doing a PhD in chemistry, and it's been a very interesting conversation I've had with some of my colleagues about that. And I was wondering what that conversation looks like in the future. How do we use the gifts that we're given through faith, through being part of a community, through being challenged by different people? What does that conversation look like? Not just in that sort of bringing your faith into the workplace, but between different communities, in building solidarity between different people. But just to sort of ruminate on that, I guess. Thank you again.
Yeah, I think that the events in America has demonstrated to us with stark relief that bridges, not walls, are absolutely fundamental. And I think that what at Stonewall we try and do is work in partnership with as many different communities as possible. So we do a huge amount with the humanists, for example, because the humanists have an absolute commitment to inclusion across the board, and they articulate that, and they are in schools and they're talking about that in a good way. So Stonewall takes our allies wherever we can find them, but Stonewall also takes it as our absolute fundamental responsibility to work with those who don't like us, and that's my job. My job is to work with people who don't like us, and we have 120 staff who are dedicated to that and spend a lot of time going, that's really interesting, have you thought about it from this angle? And Stonewall knows that unregulated rage isn't effective, outrage and anger doesn't get very far, so we're terribly courteous and we match the client, is how we talk about it. And I think for me it is about creating a social movement where people can talk about values and identity. And I think, without getting too heavy, I think that part of the problem with the assimilationist agenda, the prevalence of neoliberalism and capitalism, is that we have created an incredibly selfish a generation of people, a world, a society that is only interested in themselves and not interested in their neighbour. And I think that the increasing hatred and hostility towards people who are other is an indication of the fear that people have that something is going to be taken away from them. And I think that what the LGBT movement has in common with the Church of England movement, with the Quaker movement, is a capacity to look beyond ourselves. And I think that we should start expressing that in terms of values. One of the things that concerns me about contemporary politics, and Stonewall is assiduously non-party political, and I am assiduously non-party political, I think that they all have their strengths and weaknesses, is there is an absence of political, philosophical values at the heart of decision-making. And it is hard to know what our contemporary politicians believe in. And I don't mean that from a faith perspective necessarily, although faith will shape that. I don't know what they believe in, because everybody is so desperate to manage the message, they're no longer expressing what they believe in. And Angela Merkel, whatever you believe in her politics, you know what she believes in. She has values. She has absolute values. She's a pragmatist. She's probably pretty much right of centre, but you know what she believes in. And I think everything that is happening now is an absence of commonality and an ability to look beyond our peripheral vision. So at Stonewall, we're attempting to build those alliances and build those things. And that's why Stonewall's name isn't always on everything we do. So there's a lot of things that Stonewall puts out that has no Stonewall fingerprints on it at all, nor would we claim credit for it, because it gains more traction of building that movement without a Stonewall logo over it. And we take that very seriously. So I think that it is about all of us positioning ourselves in relation to our faith and our values in different ways, and thinking about how we can extend that. And something as simple as volunteering in a food bank and talking about it. It's not always about necessarily articulating the most coherent message of inclusion, but it is about living our values in a way that influences others and inspires and empowers others to do the same. I often have to remind people, I think, that everybody in this room has more power than other people. You have the means to be here in an evening, you have the time, you have the capacity, you have the bravery and courage it takes to come into a space like this to talk about faith and sexuality. There are 3 people who you will be able to identify immediately who have less power than you, who you can support to be empowered and do more than they might. And if we all just took that responsibility more seriously, the world would be a better place, I think. Without sounding too cliched, but I do believe that we should share our power and do our best to help people. Last 2 questions.
Hi,
Hello.
I'm a student at the University of Bristol, but I really like children. That's really inspiring. What I wanted to ask was related to what you said towards the start about this good gay sort of narrative that you find yourself originally sort of conforming to. How do you think Stonewall can now sort of challenge that narrative? What work are you doing to sort of change that stereotype? Because I think that a lot of institutions, not only the church but also the media, sort of perpetuate this heteronormative sort of lifestyle, which will be, I think it was just this idea of sort of like grow up, go to university, get married, have children, that doesn't work for everybody. How are you now sort of trying to challenge that and represent other types of lifestyles?
So I think the assimilation to gender, I think history will judge whether that was the right thing to do. I think Britain has the best legislation for LGBT people in the world, and most tightly held and most securely screwed down. Does that make it right that we had to be quite so pale and palatable? I don't know. I'm too close to it to be utterly objective in the analysis of that. I'm sure someone will write a non-EU funded PhD on it one day. I think that what Stonewall tries to do is we believe in empowering. So what Stonewall has done differently is about getting out the way, redesigning the table, creating more space for people to come around that table. So, for example, working with UK Black Pride to make sure that that event is as big and inclusive and available and accessible as possible without going, look what Stonewall made. You know, so it's much more about backing off. And I think the work with faith communities and the work with trans communities speaks to that objective and mission as well. What we've also done is had a major cultural change in Stonewall since I took over, and really done everything we can to make sure that the values we espouse externally are lived internally. And Stonewall as an organisation has staff who are utterly connected to the mission. It's an organisation where the staff have a major synergy with what we're trying to achieve. So how we work is incredibly important. How we live by our values is incredibly important, and how we act is incredibly important. So the diversity of Stonewall's staff, therefore, is changing, and how they talk about their experiences is changing. I no longer wear blouses. I know that that's a really kind of trite example, but I will. You know, I was in a meeting with the Foreign Secretary this morning dressed like this. You know, this is me, no excuses, and I'm smart and I can do stuff. So I'm not going to start changing myself in order to make myself more palatable to hope that I'll be heard. And I know that it comes as a surprise to people that I'm as good as I am, because of how I present. I think that's a lot to do with sexism. I think it's a lot to do with all sorts of things. But I know that I am constantly confounding people's expectations. And I think that we have a duty to be pushing those boundaries and showing that there are different ways of doing things. And that isn't always easy. So anyone who tells you that partnership working is easy is not. It's a complete pain. The trans manifesto that we published last week was written by 16 trans people with different trans identities, from non-binary to everything in between. Stonewall staff could have knocked that out in a weekend and we'd have been fine. Doing it in partnership with communities, however, is singularly the most important thing we can do, because those 16 people were changed by that process, were empowered by that process, and are stronger to face the challenges outlined in that document than if Stonewall had just taken it and appropriated it and assimilated it. So it's about us letting go of power and recognising we have a responsibility. One of the big areas for us is about Black, Asian and minority ethnic inclusion, really going deeper. We've got research coming out in July that shows that our interventions over the last 10 years has made a significant impact on middle-class audiences, but those from low-income backgrounds, free school meal audiences, are as let down and lost as ever. And so Stonewall has a responsibility to work with communities who are from low-income backgrounds as well. So it's an ongoing challenge, but we try and do it as best we can.
Alright, so I'm 16 and got GCSEs in about 2 weeks, so school is kind of on my mind. What are your thoughts on, and I go to a faith school, I go to a church training school, so what are your thoughts on how faith schools can both help and work with LGBT kids as they're growing up and discovering their faith and their sexuality and stuff, and also helping kids who've been kind of brought up in maybe homophobic families or have homophobic beliefs, work with those in terms of their faith and sexuality.
Thank you, and very good luck with your GCSEs. I would not be taking a night out right now, I'd be really scared. but you'll be fine, and it'll be okay. So Stonewall does a huge amount of work with faith schools. We provide free training to any school that has a faith ethos or is defined as a faith majority school. And we work with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of faith schools. And based on that, what I can tell you is that for every 5 schools who are really up for it, there are 2 who are not, and that's because they've got a bishop who's a pain. Right? So rarely do we meet resistance from the school. What we find is that the schools want to do best by their kids, and they want to help their young people be the best they can be, and to do well in their GCSEs and not get in the way of that. I think that what Stonewall works very hard to do is articulate inclusion within a faith context, and we think that's incredibly important, that there shouldn't be an assumption that in order to be LGBT inclusive, one has to drop the God. Actually, being LGBT inclusive is entirely in line with a Christian ethos. And what we find is schools are very receptive to that, including primary schools. So we do a huge amount of work with primary schools. And primary schools, we talk about different families. And we talk about the fact that kids have got 2 godmummies. And that actually a boy choosing a pink pencil does not make him gay. It just means he's chosen a pink pencil. And if someone wants to dress up in an Elsa costume, even if they're a boy, just get more Elsa costumes. So we kind of spend a lot of time helping schools chill out a little bit and not get too overly strained. There's a long way to go, because there's a lot of faith schools. And what schools talk to us a lot about is how they can work with parents. So how schools can create a space where parents can think about some of these issues. And Stonewall is increasingly creating conversations where parents can talk about the things they're frightened of and things they're scared of. My parents freaked. They were so frightened. They were so scared for me. They loved me to bits, but they were so scared that everything would go wrong, and I was too young to make that decision, and that people would be mean to me and would hurt me, and I wouldn't get on in life, and nobody helped them. You know, if I had the well of loneliness and orange is not the only fruit, my parents had nothing. Do you know what I mean? So we're desperately trying to help schools help parents, and I think that that's going to take some time. The most important thing is that young people know there are other adults around them who will provide them with that support. And that's why faith communities are incredibly important. What we don't want young people to do is leave their faith communities. Because if you lose your parents and your friends and your faith community, that's where it all gets problematic when you're older. That's what leaves marks when you're older that takes longer to unpick. So between us, we can make some really good progress. And once you've finished your GCSEs, come and talk to us, and we can see if we can do something different in the schools as well. Thank you very much for your attention this evening.